Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to another episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah. We have another great guest for you today. His name is Zander Cannon, and Zander has been around and in the industry for such a long time. A great artist came up in my neck of the woods near Boston. Started off with New England Comics Tick spinoff, the Chainsaw Vigilante. Did his own comic called The Replacement God. Then worked on Top 10, which you know as a book from Alan Moore, America's Best Comics, where he did sort of a tag team art effort with Gene Ha, another previous guest, and has gone on from there to so many different projects, including Heck, which is a graphic novel from Top Shelf Productions, and of course Kaijumax, which is a series he has been creating and writing since 2015. So love the big monsters, love everything Zander does, but he's just a really great guy, has a unique perspective on comics and his career. So let's hear from him. This is Zander Cannon. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for coming on the show.
Absolutely.
So we're going to start you out with our patented first question, which is how and when did you discover comics?
Oh, discover comics. How well, my next door neighbor, like I was a little bit late to comics. I mean, of course I picked them up in spinner racks and stuff in drugstores and what have you, but um my next door neighbor was into comics in the mid 80s, and so he had picked up, you know, Ninja Turtles and Dark Knight and this and let's I think Watchmen and Gru the Wanderer, which is a big one for me, and then um, yeah, and so he was the first person to sort of go like, you can collect comics and you can kind of go to the store and you can get all the back issues and you can follow artists and that sort of stuff. And that was really that was eye-opening to me. I mean, other than that, it was like reading an old Superman comic that my grandma had in a drawer, you know. So this is sort of the first time I was like, oh wow, this is like a real thing. And going to the comic book store every Wednesday and all that sort of stuff. So I was probably 13 maybe when that was happening. That was in Lakewood, Ohio. uh, yeah, and yeah, it was really. I mean, there were so many great things coming out at the time, and so many different genres that I could kind of find what I wanted, even if it was much less diverse than it is now. But it was still sort of like, oh, well, here are the funny books, and here are the serious crime dramas and stuff like that, and here's the nom or whatever, like that was a big one. I thought that was really cool, and yeah.
Do you
So
remember any of those other early issues that you collected? What do you remember the Superman issue in your grandma's
yeah, absolutely. It
drawer?
was the one. It had a Neil Adams cover. It was the one where he was suddenly immune to kryptonite. It was like the 1970s one. So it is
Okay.
Kurt Swan did the interiors, and then Neil Adams did the cover, and it's that famous cover where he's like bursting out of the kryptonite chains,
Yes.
and
Yeah, I remember that.
oh
I
yeah,
don't
just
remember the number, but I
yeah,
remember the
just and
cover.
of course I read it, and there was that sequence where he's like eats the kryptonite, in
Yep.
front of the
Right, right.
thug who's trying to like poison him or whatever, and goes, huh, could use a little salt or whatever, and I was like, oh, this is peak comics for me.
Yeah.
uh but like
But
but then I remember really getting into the comics like Flaming Carrot. There was a comic called Ralph Snart Adventures, that was sort of like he was a guy in a mental institution who would sort of dream up all these stories that he was in, adventure stories that he was in, and let's see. I mean, Gru the Wanderer. I remember reading Nth Man. Do you remember that comic
yeah,
by Larry
yeah,
Hama and Ron Wagner? I mean, I just thought that was
yes.
the
I do
greatest.
remember that.
And then yeah, I mean, Gru the Wanderer was a huge one. Of course, Mad Magazine was a big thing for me, and I always love Sergio's stuff, and he's a huge influence on me, like that sort of like overstuffed style, and I loved that kind of thing, and anybody who could put humor into a pretty straightforward. I wouldn't call a Gru straightforward story, but I mean, anybody who could put humor into their artwork, I was all in on that. Alan Davis in the superhero realm was always putting in funny little characters in the background, and I'm like,
Mhm.
that's the stuff.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, putting the comic into comics, right?
You're right, right. And I mean, yeah, like make it. And I think also there was such a thing about like how much a comic cost. I mean, like I remember being a kid and buying your comics with your own money. It's like, well, you're really aware of like how much you're getting out of it, like, um, and so, you want your 75 cents worth or whatever. And
Yeah,
so
for
if there's
sure.
going to be a bunch of extra stuff and hidden message and whatever, it's like, well, yeah, that's great. That's a must buy.
Yeah, for sure. And when did the thought pop into your head, and this might have been much later, or maybe it wasn't, that you could possibly do this as a career?
Um, Not too much later, but I remember up until that point, I thought, oh, I love drawing. I would love to be an animator, like a Disney animator. I think is what I was like, what I kind of wanted to do. And I mean, and of course I was a kid, so I didn't have a realistic view of what that meant or what the various options were. But when I saw these comics, and here's an interesting one. One of the comics that I got at the local comic store was Cynical Man, and I don't know if you know that, but Matt Fizel he did all these stick figure comics in the 80s. And so like one was Cynical Man, one was Antisocial Man, one was Cute Girl. And they were, he was a great artist, but he just drew them as stick figures so that they'd be really fast. And they were all, a quarter of a sheet of paper. And that was the point that I was like, oh, this seems within reach, like I can draw stick figures, but it was more like, oh, I could see that he was drawing them at print size. And so I could kind of go, oh, let me figure that out, and I remember drawing a little comic and figuring out how to paginate it so that I could photocopy it and cut it in half and fold it up. And so yeah, when I was in middle school, I did that, and I did a comic called you could tell it was the 80s because I did a comic called the Ninja Garbage Man. And so
Sure.
yeah, and so and I figured out how to make this little 8-page mini comic, and sold it to my friends at school and whatever, and with a quarter, and that was really great because it one showed me that I could do it, but two showed me like how much further I had to go, because it's like, oh, this is hard, like. And when you're drawing something and you're not drawing it from the exact angle that you know how to draw it because you're trying to make the story work, that's hard. It's not just like, oh, I'm just sketching in my sketchbook, drawing whatever, like, I really want to draw. I have to draw a person, walking through a door or something boring, So, yeah, that was a big moment for me where I was sort of having to figure that all out.
You're not the first person we've talked to that had this epiphany that making comics is hard.
Yeah, right.
Which is funny because I think you look at them, you look at them, and for some reason you think that because of maybe, especially in your case, the sort of the lighthearted nature of some of the ones that you were looking at, and reading, like Gru and things like that, that they're just because they're lighthearted and sort of fun, that
Yeah, it's gonna
making
be
them must be the same way, right?
Yeah, it's gonna be a cinch. Yeah, yeah, and I mean, and I think too, like each part of it is kind of easy, right? Like everybody can kind of letter it a little bit, and everybody can kind of draw it. But then it's like, oh, well, when you put it all together, and I mean, this is if you're just doing it all yourself. It's like it's this unbelievably steep curve,
Right.
and you are having to go like, oh my gosh, this is a lot to keep in mind. Yeah, so.
So
Uh,
you well, I don't know if you would call this broken proper, but I would consider it the break-in, which was on Chainsaw Vigilante, which is kind of a spin-off from The Tick, which I actually didn't know. I'm in the Boston area that emerged out of New England Comics,
yeah,
which
New
is
England comics
the
in Quincy.
bookstore. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I
Um,
guess they're all over the place, but
right.
the publisher was in Quincy.
Okay. Tell
Yeah.
me about how that all came about.
That was, I mean, I was born in Boston, but I at the time I was in college and I was in Iowa, and so I was just, I was pretty ambitious, and I had done a bunch of comic strips for the school paper, and I thought, I'm done, paid my dues, right?
I'm ready
And
for the
so
big time.
I started to send out, I mean, I just went home for a break or whatever, and I just looked at all the comics that I had, and I basically just wrote down all their addresses from the indicia and sent it to like submissions editor. And I mean, I was sending them to places that had been out of business for years. And but of course, I loved the Tick, and so I'd send in stuff to the Tick, and into New England Comics. And Bob Polio, who's still there, uh, is was he really sort of was the guy who was my champion there, where he really believed in me and was really kind to it was really kind to me all along. And and we just yeah, when I did this, I mean, God, I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, and when talk about a steep learning curve going from I mean, even an 8-page mini comic, but I was doing like one little comic strip a week to all of a sudden having to do this whole comic. And they weren't giving me a tough deadline, but it was I suddenly had to come up with a lot of story and a lot of art and a lot of and everything was like times 1,000 of like, well, now you got to draw a car and you got to draw a building and you got to draw a whole city and you got to draw this and you got to draw 50 superheroes in the background. And yeah, and also I had to write it and make it all fit. And God, I mean, it's a mess. Like, there's moments, it has its moments, but it's a mess.
I was just saying, you got to cut through, a little bit of the mess before you find, I don't know, the diamond, I suppose. But
Right. Well, you got to get your 10,000 bad drawings out or whatever,
right,
is
exactly,
what Chuck Jones said. Yeah.
Yeah. Cut your teeth in that way. So you're on this. You're doing, you're maturing at a very high rate as an artist because you're being asked to do a lot more than probably you were doing in the college strips. So what after that you kind of strike out on your own? Did you feel like you've taken a lot of this learning and you're ready to do what eventually became the Replacement God, or am I missing a few steps in
No,
that?
that was right. When I was still in school. So when I did I did Chainsaw Vigilante is sort of like the summer between my junior and senior year.
Okay.
Yeah, junior and senior year. And then no, that's wrong. Sophomore and junior year. So I was young. I was 20 when I started Chainsaw Vigilante. And so then, I was back at school and I wasn't really sort of like trying to get anything right away, but I was still sending things out. And I sent out something to Slave Labor Graphics. They were the people because they published Milk and Cheese and Pirate Core and all the the stuff by Evan Dorkin. And I was loving that stuff, of course. And so yeah, that was an interesting switch because New England Comics was more or less what I expected a comic book company to be, where they said, "Oh, we have this series that we have planned, and we would like you to do these tasks on it," And I mean, they were pretty loose about the editorial, sort of direction, but you slot it in. Whereas I felt like I wanted that from Slave Labor Graphics, but they're just an indie publisher, and they were like, send us, like, I was like, do you have any penciling gigs or anything? And they're like, just send us a pitch, see if we want to publish it. I'm like, oh, geez, okay, and I kind of flipped a coin between doing like a science fiction one or a fantasy one and a fantasy one, and so I just thought, like, well, here I go, like, here's a whole bunch of like crazy drawings, and here's a whole bunch of like completely arcane world building that was way over the top, and they're like, yeah, sure, that sounds great. We'll pay you a royalty when and if it sells. That was the business model, and that's the business model of a ton of small publishers.
Right.
So.
And did you have this idea in your back pocket? Like,
no,
you just kind of like birthed it from necessity?
Yeah, in fact, I was sort of midway through on a science fiction pitch, and then I was like, it's not really sort of coalescing, or it was becoming more whatever. I felt like this fantasy one was going to be a little bit easier, not easier to draw, but more fun to draw, because my style works better with organic shapes and trees rather than ships or whatever. And I mean, it was just kind of a hero's journey type of thing, and I don't really remember the process of it. I just remember doing a lot of drawings and figuring it all out, and of course, like drastically changing how I was, what tools I was using, and how I was, figuring out how to do the storytelling, and I don't know. It was, I mean, it was like you said, like just learning this stuff so fast that, I mean, every time you come out with something, people are like, "Oh, that's pretty interesting," and I'm like, "That's garbage." Like, you should see the stuff I'm doing now. In 2 months, it'll be out. Which now it's like, all right, everything's, it's fine. What you say 6 months ago, that's about what I can do still.
Is it too much to say that it was somewhat improvisational? Or did you, once you had the pitch and started doing the actual series, you kind of knew what beats you were going to start
Um,
getting?
yeah, and it wasn't. I mean, it was quarterly. So, and I didn't start it. I mean, I think I did it. I finished it before my senior year, but then I didn't start the series. Like, I finished the first issue
Okay.
before my senior year. Then I didn't start the series until afterwards, and it was quarterly. So it was, there was plenty of time to sort of like play with it, and it wasn't too improvisational. I mean, other than the fact that, like, it was a sort of an ongoing series, and so you just kind of like, you kind of are only thinking a couple issues ahead.
Mhm.
I mean, I had an overall story kind of, but I mean, it's not even done 30 years later, so I guess I only sort of had a story. um, but yeah, it was. I mean, it certainly took all of my mental energy. Like, I wasn't doing anything else creative at that time. I was really focused on it. So,
Yeah.
um, so I mean, I'm sure there was some improvisation, but I was probably doing a lot of repetition of jobs. I would sort of like do, thumbnails of it, and then I would do like, slightly smaller or slightly larger, like rough pencils, and then I would do, rougher pencils that were full size, and anyway, it just figuring it all out and trying to do it properly was just a constant learning process.
Yeah. You're finding your method,
Yeah,
as they say.
yeah, yeah.
And in the middle of this, I think it was about in the middle of this, you switched publishers to Image. Is that right?
Yeah, Jim Valentino, he had started Shadowline, or I guess Shadowline had already existed through Shadowhawk and stuff, but then he sort of opened it up to a bunch of indie creators, and so, like, Brian Bendis was in that sort of cohort as well, and trying to think who else was in that immediate group, but it was, yeah, I mean, and so, that didn't win me any friends over at Slave Labor, but I mean, I guess I was kind of, I mean, it was kind of like I'm being blown by the winds of fate, like, I was like, well, I gotta, I gotta do it, and I mean, that was kind of right, but, like, also, Image is a trickier place because it's like, well, and it's still that way. They take a certain flat rate off the top of every comic that they come out. So if you are really popular and your book sells really well, you can make an absolute fortune. But if if you're me in 1997, yeah, you might do that for a couple. It might be even the biggest check you've ever seen for the first issue, but then it drops off pretty quickly if people aren't, like, wild about it. So. So that was too bad. It only went 5 issues, and I think I might have. I think I was going to have to pay in to publish the 6th issue, and I thought, I don't think that this is going to work. So I self-published the 6th
Mhm.
issue, uh, and that was fine. But I still have boxes and boxes and boxes. Want one? I mean, like, if you want a copy, believe me, I can get it to you. Because
Sure. I'll always take a copy.
yeah.
So you hinted at that the story might not be done even these 30 years later. Is that something you might eventually get back to?
I always say I will. I mean, publishers have sort of said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing this?" And part of me is just, well, part of me is like, well, I'm always kind of in the middle of other things, but I always just think, like, I mean, if you'll pay me to do it, if you pay me a page rate, I think I will do it. But it's so hard to do things on spec,
Yeah,
when you're not 23 years old,
yeah, I hear you. I get it. Yeah, life
So
gets in
I
the
would love
way.
to, I'd love to finish it, but it's also, again, it's also a story about being young. And being directionless, and and being 21 years old. And it's like, well, now I'm 51 years old, and my son's not even that far away from being 21 years old, and
Right.
so yeah. I mean, I think it would. I think I could very, easily get into the space, but it isn't what I'm thinking about in my downtime. You know what I mean?
Yeah. 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 Well, you never know.
You never
You
know.
know,
I mean,
youth springs eternal, or
yeah,
I guess
that's
it's
right.
hope springs eternal. But either way,
Yeah,
never know. You can get back into that 21-year-old mindset at some point.
yeah. Well, and I mean, and it would be interesting. It'd be interesting to go back and be interesting to color it. It'd be, like it's a black and white book, but a black and white book doesn't have the same vibe anymore than it used to, where
Hmm.
it's like, well, that was what indie books were, and now it's like indie books are in color now too,
Yeah.
because it's not really that much more expensive to print them in color than it is black and white. So,
Right.
so it'd be interesting to go back and color it with what I know about color now, and you know,
Cool.
don't get me
We'll
thinking
cross
about it.
our
See now,
fingers,
then
but
I'm gonna.
I won't. We won't be waiting on pins and needles. Um, so let's get into top 10.
Oh yeah.
Um, how, so I find that fascinating from a number of different vantage points. I do want to get into sort of the process because it was, maybe not your typical. I think a few artist teams have done what you and Gene Ha have done. But
Yeah.
first of all, I'd like to know how the gig came to you.
Well, the gig came to Gene because he was a name at the time, and already, and so he was, uh, and of course there, Alan Moore's one of his great skills is sort of playing to people's strengths, and so I think
Mhm.
that he sort of looked at Gene Ha's stuff and said, "Oh man, this guy can do realistic stuff down, sort of grounded, sort of realistic looking people." But also sort of superhero stuff. And then, his architecture is top notch. And so let's make this world this crazy, glass column of crazy buildings. And so and then Gene and I had met maybe the year before, at a signing, just,
Mhm.
that was near enough to him and near enough to me that we had both kind of come to it. And I think he was living in Indiana at the time. But then he moved up to the Twin Cities. And so when he moved up there, I think that he was working with another guy who was going to be like the background guy for Top 10, because he knew it was it was too much work for one person. And so that guy didn't work out, and so he was kind of like, 15 pages into the first issue, and he said, do you want to help me out on this? And I'm like, more than anything I can, more than anything I've ever wanted in my whole life. Yes. But I don't think that I'm the right person to do backgrounds, in architecture. I'm awful at it. It's not where my strengths lie.
Yeah.
But maybe we could split things up where it's like, well, my strengths are more in the sense of like storytelling, especially. And I felt like as soon as I read Top 10, I got the vibe of, okay, let's tell this story in a very grounded, very almost like documentary style, visual sort of storytelling style. And so when we started to do that, and then he's like, okay, then you can maybe pencil and ink some of the kookier characters or whatever, like, oh, here's a guy who's like a warthog with like an exposed brain or whatever. And so we did that for a while, and that was fun, and it was really interesting. And I mean, it was, and again, it's like my brain was so revved up, like it was this massive, learning curve again, and that's fun. But what was interesting about it is that we found out that, like, as much as Gene was more the mainstream artist and I was the indie artist, I had a much more mainstream workflow than he did. Like, his workflow was like, well, let's do roughs, but then let's take photographs of, like models and stuff like that, and then we'll, like, I'll pencil these things that are sort of like wireframe, like, sort of like to get all the proportions correct. And I'm like, no, like, layouts, pencils, inks, like that was my workflow. And so it wasn't meshing very well, and so like I would kind of do these things that were more traditional, or they were sort of more sort of focused on the composition, and he would erase it and like mess around with it and like and do this, and I'm like, we can't keep sort of like duplicating the work. We just will never get done in a million years. And so what ended up happening is that we ended up sort of saying, all right, well, I will do, like, if we're doing 50-50 now, I'm going to scale back and do 25%, which is basically like layouts, word balloons, and not, just where the word balloons are, right. All the story, the storytelling. I'll put in roughs of like, this is what this character's face is going to look like. I mean, it'll just be like a simpler version of the final comic. And then Gene does his artwork on top of it. And that ended up working really well because, it ended up putting a lot of work on Gene's plate. But I think that he felt like having a running start with the layouts really helped him, Mm-hmm. And I think that he, his art style is so, like, to coin a phrase, it's so expensive, in terms of time and complexity, sure. That like you want to know what you're doing before you start. Like you don't want to noodle around with that kind of when you're kind of spending money at that rate. You know what I mean? And so if I could get things going and you could read it and go, oh, this comic is going to work, then it's easier to start really drawing those windows in the background.
Right. What strikes me about that arrangement is that it seems like you are, even at the 25%, sort of the go-between between Alan's scripts and Gene's finished artwork, right?
Yeah.
And so you were almost interpreting to a certain degree what was coming in on the pages from Alan. Did he understand what was kind of going on with your processes?
Alan Moore, did Alan Moore understand it? I don't think that he was too I don't think he was too interested in that, and I don't think he had the time to be interested, because I mean, this was just one week out of his month was writing top 10, and then he had to be like instantly changed to Promethea, Tom Strong. And then Tomorrow Stories was like 3 or 4 different stories, so it's like I'm sure he was going nuts at all times. I mean, I think that he understood it, but I think that it was more like he just saw what was coming out of it and he's like, great, super,
Whatever way you achieve that.
Yeah. And I mean, and everything was just a forward, it was just the bulldozer forward, like he wouldn't go back and edit scripts. Like I remember one time he made a mistake in one of the scripts and had a character be in a room that he was established to be somewhere else. And so he just, in the next page, he just goes, oh yeah, I made a mistake on page 19. So just replace it with this other character. Same dialogue, same business. And we were like, sure, great. I mean, I think that book was so well thought out, otherwise, that like little tweaks like that weren't a big deal.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was sort of interpreting. I mean, it was like, they were complex scripts. They were they were long scripts because they were very chatty. They weren't like a Swiss watch. They were just like, well, here's what I'm thinking. Like here's what here's how it starts, and maybe this and maybe that, and possibly put in this. It was very conversational, and so for a person, me, to be able to go like, all right, these are the things that are important. Out of this, we gotta focus on this, and and then I could highlight things for Gene to look at and remember, and so.
And was there a specific issue, a specific panel, and a time period where you felt like, okay, everything now has clicked? We've figured out this kind of this artistic process. Alan's churning out scripts. We're in the zone.
I mean, I think, like sort of in the middle of the second issue, I think that we were sort of like, all right, this is what we're going to do. Like, this is the layout that I'm going to do. This is what Gene's going to do with that. And because he was, I would design incidental characters, or I would design incidental sort of like locations. based on the needs of the story and based on sort of like the needs of the composition. And Gene would typically redesign those because he's like, oh well, the technology of the city dictates that this and this would be built out of that and that, and so it's like great. And so that was the part where I could sort of step back from sort of like from having sort of a design in sense, or like a design sort of input to just a storytelling input, which I think we were all a lot happier when that had sort of been worked out. Um,
Right.
yeah.
And so you moved on. I don't know if it was sequentially, like directly after, or maybe in the middle of the two seasons, to a spinoff from Top 10, which was Smax.
Oh yeah.
Uh, right?
Yeah. That was right after the first season, the first 12 issues. Yeah.
Right. Um, how did that come to you? And were you like ecstatic to be doing, full pencils
Oh yeah.
for that?
Yeah, and I mean and of course it's fantasy, so I'm like, well, that's great. It's my wheelhouse, and so and I had done a short story called Dead Fellas, which was sort of like the vampire mob in Neapolis, and that was just a short story. And I think that Alan was just sort of like, I have these artists, I might as well, I think that he has a very sort of like uh, a certain business sense where it's just like, if I can keep everybody sort of employed, if I can keep everybody kind of working, like it just makes it better for everybody. And so, and that was a lot of what that kind of stuff was. It's like, oh well, this isn't happening right now, so let's do Smax, and let's do 49ers for Gene. And it was fantastic. I mean, I think that I was over my head a little bit, because I was being a perfectionist about the inks. And so anyway, Andrew Curry came on to ink it, and I mean, he's fantastic. He's a great inker, better than I deserved. and um and yeah, it was great. And it was, I think that I remember getting a little heat for how like sort of cartoony and sort of like idiosyncratic some of the designs were, but I also thought, this is fun. It's fun. It really couldn't exist any other way. So what are you gonna do?
Yeah, I was going to ask that question about, how much freedom you really had to play around, given what I guess Gene had sort of established in the main book. Were, it sounds like you were able to kind of do what you wanted to
Yeah.
within certain parameters,
Yeah, and I mean, and I was,
keeping characters consistent, for
yeah, I
instance.
was, I was careful about that. I mean, I wanted all the characters to be consistent, but I mean, honestly, from page one, there was virtually no characters other than Smax and Robin who were even in it. So that didn't matter, and then everything else was just stuff that was designed by me. And so and then it had the usual thing about comics where it's like, this is due, so no one's going to be fussing with the designs, or like tweaking things by 1%, because it's like, well, this has got to be turned in, and this has got to go to press in like 3 days. So and at that time I had actually moved to Japan for a couple of years, and so I was sending stuff back via, I think Airborne Express was. Oh no, Airborne Express wasn't there, even though DC wanted it to be. I was sending it back through, FedEx from Japan. I was sending them originals,
Wow.
and yeah, I mean, it's funny to think about that. Like, that's absurd now. The idea that you would send originals. I mean, that you would
Yeah.
have original. That I would even have originals is
Right. Right.
absurd. But like, yeah.
That's crazy. Um, I'd like to move on to Big Time Attic, which is, I guess, called a publisher, right? A self-publishing
Kinda.
initiative.
No,
Um,
well, it was mainly supposed to be an artist collective slash bit, sort of art, studio, or um I mean, the thing is, it started to be like, okay, let's get a team of artists so that we can do comics, and we can do them fast, and we don't have to sort of like we can have a penciler, inker, letterer, all sort of in one studio and knock
Right.
that stuff out instead of having to send it all over. And but quickly, what happened is that we ended up sort of forming another division of it, which was animation, and doing like little micro games that were on the web. You know, this is kind of pre-smartphone.
Hmm.
Um, and so there would be like, oh, here's a Ed and Eddie game, or here's a Tom and Jerry game, or here's a Scooby Doo game, or whatever. And so once that was happening, I sort of retreated more into comics, and I started doing some writing, and I started doing a little bit of solo stuff, and eventually those businesses split. Um, One of them, like the animation division, became Puny, and they went on to work on Yo Gabba Gabba and like create a show called Danger and Eggs and um, all kinds of stuff. They just moved on to Hollywood, and they were on a completely different scale than us because that was what the stressful thing was. What this was that the animation department would make this much money, but it would also spend this much money. And here's us in the comics world making and spending minuscule amounts, and being so stressed about making payroll or whatever. And it's like this should not be this should not be happening. We should not be taking on this stress. And
Right.
so we split off, and then Kevin Cannon, who is not related to me, we kept the name Big Time Attic, and we kept doing, but we would credit ourselves as our own names. And we did a lot of educational comics after that, because that was those were sort of the projects that were falling into our lap. And so we did 2 books with Jim Ottaviani at GT Labs, T minus, and Bone Sharps, Cowboys, and Thunder Lizards, sort of science history stuff. Um, we did a book about genetics with Mark Schultz. We did a book about evolution with Jay Hostler. We did Kevin then did a philosophy book with a philosophy professor. We did a rhetoric book for Bedford St. Martin's that is an actual like it's an actual like textbook that gets reprinted every year. And um, yeah, and so that was what that became, was sort of like me and Kevin doing collaborative projects that were generally speaking nonfiction and generally speaking educational.
Interesting that it ended up being or landing so far from what I think the original idea was.
Yeah,
But that's how things evolve.
yeah, I'd really kind of thought that it was going to be sort of like collaborative graphic novels, and it was, but I think that our third partner ended up wanting to do animation so badly that it just kind of pulled
Right,
everything in that direction. And
right.
it's like, great, that's great. And it was an iterative process. We figured it all out.
So Kevin Cannon of no relation, what made your working relationship, your collaboration so fitting and so successful? Because it seems like once you guys got together, you did, work for quite a while on a
Yeah.
number of different projects.
Well, I mean, I'll say this. Kevin is the best cartoonist I've ever met. I mean, he can do everything. He can do everything so well, and he was very, very easy to work with. I mean, we could divide. That was the nice thing too, is my skill set had gone up and his skill set had gone up, and so then we both could do everything. We were both good
Mhm.
letterers, we were both good colorists, we were both good, pencilers and inkers, and we both were good at characters. We both were good at like backgrounds, and so we could kind of divide it up however. And so I think that what usually happened is that I would sort of have a more intense opinion about like how the story should be told. So he's like, yeah, draw all the pencil the characters. I'll knock in some backgrounds, and we can both ink it, and he'll letter. He was moving to digital lettering because that's what the publisher needed. And um, yeah, and it was just he was such an easy collaborator and such an easy person to work with. I mean, we were in the same studio, so it just was, it just fell into place. And I mean, and I think we've both moved into different things, and I think that it's interesting to see what the two of us where we ended up after being basically doing the exact same thing. It's like I ended up doing, sort of like kind of idiosyncratic, like back to comics, sort of indie mid-level comics, and he has ended up doing illustrations. Maps is a big thing. He does maps of like um, and like all the indie bookstores in Minnesota or whatever, and then or he'll be like, the Minneapolis Star Tribune will say we need a map of the new green line that's going into the light rail, and so he'll draw that and it'll be in the newspaper. And I mean, it's gorgeous. He just did a children's book also about Joe Mauer on the Twins, and so and so he has become sort of the local guy, and to the point that the Star Tribune was saying like, we need to hire somebody else because we can't have this guy be our house style because he doesn't work here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny how you guys were so in sync, and not to say you're out of sync now, but that you kind of, I don't know, went off in slightly different directions,
Yeah.
and found, I guess, followed your own individual muses.
Yeah, I mean, right at the end, he had made a book called Far Arden, which was a graphic novel. It was nominated for an Eisner Award. It was really well received, and then he did the sequel to that called Crater 15. And right at the same time, I did a graphic novel called Heck, and so then we had both gotten them published or gotten an agreement to publish them with Top Shelf. And so that was when we did Double Barrel, which and that was sort of like in the very beginning of when people got sort of iPads and and so it was this digital anthology of two people where it was serializing two different graphic novels, and then we did a whole bunch of FAQs in the middle, and then we did some little strips and funny little jokes, and we would invite friends to come and do a story or whatever, and that was great fun too. And I think that was sort of the end of our doing nonfiction stuff together, because we were doing that. And then once those fiction graphic novels came out, then I sort of started to feel like, oh, I'm really wanting to do fiction again, and that's what led to Kaijumax after that. And Kevin I think did one more nonfiction thing, which is philosophy, and then he sort of took over any of the updates to the versions for the rhetoric book, because the Bedford St. Martin's textbook, there's new editions every couple of years, so he took over that, which I think worked out great for him, because you know how much textbooks cost, so they pay really well.
No kidding. Yeah, I actually, my day job is working at a college, so
Okay.
I know intimately
Right,
the
right.
struggles of students, but also the profits for those who are
Yeah, no
selling it
kidding.
these
Well,
days.
there should be a middle ground, but in any case,
Yeah.
uh,
Before we move on to Kaijumax, because I definitely want to talk about that, I did want to talk just a little bit more about Double Barrel and the digital format. Eventually Heck came out, as you said, from Top Shelf as a, physical book. But when you were first doing it, I mean, what did you think of the digital format? Did you struggle with it? Was it just like anything else? What you had done before, just kind of on the computer and more easily able to be accessed by a larger audience?
I mean, I think there was a lot of, I was reading Boing Boing, and I was getting the sense for like, okay, there's this sort of digital revolution just about to happen. That's what I was thinking about. Like, I thought, oh, print comics, or at least print serialized comics, were on the way out. Yeah, and so I was thinking about, I mean, and when I was first starting it, I really didn't even think it was going to be published at all. I was almost just like, I'm doing an extra project to sort of see, just to see like the limits of my productivity, like, because I was doing 12 pages in a day. Like, and that was the whole thing. It was an hour a page, 12 over a 12-hour period. And we would get friends together, and we would go to the coffee shop, and we would just like knock these things out. And and so I was just like, well, it's almost disposable. And then I started serializing it, just on a blog, and then when we did Double Barrel, I remember thinking like, oh yeah, like this could be a, you know, I thought, oh, any moment this is going to kind of take off, and this is going to kind of be a real thing. But I mean, I think that one, iPads were so new that not everybody had them, and two, it was like, I mean, I don't know, it didn't have the star power of like we were just kind of regular old Joes making a comic book. But also, like, we were charging too little. You know, we were like, it's Double Barrel, we're going to charge $2. And, like, you know, it's like, yeah, power to the people. We're going to have a cheapo, you know, comic that's like the old pulp novels. And it's like, get over yourself. You know, first of all, $2 is ridiculous. It could at least be $5, and no one would even blink, you know, because some of the issues were 100 pages long. And so, you know, because it just, and so anyway, I mean, I think that I had a ton of, like, terrible assumptions about what was happening. And, but it was fun. It was really interesting, and it was neat to feel like this is something new and something that we're trying out something that might work. So
I think it was a really interesting era, and not to say, digital comics have gone away. They certainly haven't.
right.
But there was that time period where everybody is trying to figure out this whole new technology. I mean, not only just having the internet, but as you said, sort of these iPads and tablets. And it's just seemed like, well, everything's just going to be on here now. I mean, Star
Yeah.
Trek told us so. So everybody's just like, let's figure this out. And,
Yeah.
and there were some interesting experiments, but, and maybe there are some in the future, but ultimately I think it just became a different avenue for sort of consuming comics. It
Well, and
wasn't
there was
really a revolution.
yeah, there was so much friction in terms of paying and how easy it wasn't to pay
Yeah.
for all these things.
Mhm.
And then it really added up too, like, I mean, it's appalling what we do now to art through things like Spotify or these streaming things where it's like, oh yeah, you get a nickel every time somebody reads this, if you're lucky, probably one hundredth of a nickel. And so but even then it was like, well, people don't sort of buy them willy-nilly when when like a song's $2 or whatever. It's like, well, that's not even cheaper than a CD, like. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting time period. I mean, I think that it was sort of the last sort of gasp of like an indie publisher's sort of crack at it. You know what I mean? Like, now you have to be part of this giant conglomerate that serves you everything that you've ever wanted. And it's really hard to sort of like break in as somebody, if you were like a small publisher who had 4 titles, it's like, how do you get people to pay, $10 for, a month for that?
Right. Let's move on to Kaijumax.
Okay.
Shall we? Tell me about the origins of that title. Were you a big, Japanese monster fan growing up?
Growing up, I liked them. But I didn't have a particular sort of, love for them. You just catch them on TV or whatever, and I thought that was great because they were weird and that's fun. But it was when my son was little. My son is Korean, and so when he was little, I was looking around at sort of like kids media, and it's like, I don't see any Asian heroes, and that was really not that long ago. But I mean, this is like 2010 or something like that, and so I just happened across Ultraman at like the local Target. And obviously Ultraman is Japanese, and that's not that's
in your background too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I had this sort of knowledge of it from that, and just in general. And I mean, and I just thought, well, it'd be nice for him to be able to see somebody who looks like him as a hero. And so anyway, he loved it. He loved it like you couldn't believe. And so we watched every one of those episodes like 10 times. And it's pretty silly. If you've watched Ultraman, I mean, it's even sillier than Godzilla. And then we were also watching Godzilla movies from like the 60s, around that same era, which were very silly and very much for kids. And that just got me. I mean, you can't help but think about this sort of stuff. You're like, well, geez, I wonder what these monsters do when they're not, on camera. Like, what's
Right.
what's the deal? And I mean, I think that and then I kind of had a couple versions of it, like, oh, just hanging out, or oh, what if there's a bar, or what if and then finally I got to sort of came across the idea of like, well, what about a prison? And I think at around the same time I had watched Oz by, on HBO, and like,
Hmm.
and been like, oh, okay, so this is something that's so awful, so god awful, combined with something that's so silly. And already I like that.
Yeah.
That's in my wheelhouse. And so yeah, and I mean I still think that early on it sort of like tilted towards the awful. Like I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna do this hardcore,
Dark.
super dark, prison drama. And and I had to kind of find the level of it where I go,
Mhm.
all right, let's maybe make it a little lighter, or a little less awful. Like, let's not lean into the tropes so hard. But
Right.
that's just the learning process.
I mean, it sort of makes sense that these monsters who are getting into all sorts of trouble would, if they're not vanquished through through death,
Right.
that they got to go somewhere, and where are you going to put them in?
Right.
Is prison,
Yeah,
right?
it's entirely
So
logical. I mean, it's such a logical comic.
totally.
um but yeah, and I think, and that was a period of time too, mid 2010s, that where people were talking about like there were a lot of comics that were about like, I mean, there's like Shirtless Bear Fighter, and there was like a lot of sort of like mashups of,
Right.
Draculas and bears and sharks and the, whatever.
Cowboy Ninja something.
Yeah, yeah.
I feel like Viking Cowboy
Right,
Ninja.
right.
Something
Like,
like
I
that.
mean,
Yeah, yeah.
Shaolin Cowboy, I don't know.
Right,
Like,
right. Yeah.
yeah. So in a way it fit in. And I mean, I wanted it to, I mean, I had this knowledge about my own sort of like aesthetic as a creator, and that was that I was pretty downbeat. Like, I knew that my stuff, like, because I had just done Heck, and so Heck was pretty downbeat and pretty grim and pretty sad. And so I was like, well, maybe I should start at 100, so that when I drag it down, inevitably it kind of winds up in the middle, and everybody can kind of enjoy it a little bit. And that worked really well too, because it's like, yeah, it's candy colored, but oh, it's the grimmest thing that you've read this year. So like, and I think that helps too. Like, uh, it helps make it a little bit more palatable, and I think that my art style makes it a lot more palatable. Like, there's some pretty terrible stuff in there, and it's like, well, but everybody kind of looks like, you know, they're in a Warner Brothers cartoon, so
Right.
we can live with
Yeah.
that. You know.
Yeah. No, I think you found that balance. How much did you going into this? I mean, I think like many projects, people go into it and like, let me get the first one out. But how much did you have planned? Because eventually there were, 6 seasons worth
Yeah.
of story.
Well, we had planned to do that many,
Okay.
and it was a purely sort of like marketing consideration, where they're like, well, I was like, I don't know, what do you think, 5? And they're like, why don't you do 6? Because then you can divide it by 3, or you can divide it by 2, or like, and so like you can have 6 books, but then
The
you can also
math,
have 3
the math
hardcover,
makes sense. Yeah.
yeah. And so I was like, sure, okay, great. And so and then I was winging it on a lot of stuff, but I think that I would sort of come up with character arcs that just were that season, but I would always run out of space. And so like then I would kind of go like, oh well, this last little bit we can kick that down the road. That'll go in the next season. That'll be fine. And and then it'll work out fine. And until I got to the final season, and then I'm like, oh god, there's no more road. Like, I don't know what to do. So anyway, yeah, the 6 season's a little overstuffed in my opinion because of that.
I mean,
Um,
is there a possibility of, eventually bringing it back?
I mean, I think that kind of stuff would be fun. We've pitched it to TV and all this sort of stuff, and so if that were down the road, if that were sort of like, we could see that on the horizon, I think that maybe I'd probably do something else to just so that it would sell really well, you know. But my intention was to just leave it. Was to just be like
Mhm.
this, yeah, this canonically or in universe, everything, the status quo is essentially the same at the end as it was at the beginning, but I felt like this is the window of time that I wanted to tell us in, and these are the characters that we care about. And if it were to be a TV show and people wanted to say like, hey, let's eliminate this and this character and introduce this and this character, I feel like I'd be like, yeah, that sounds great. Like that, it's more about the place than it is about, um, yeah, if you wanted to be like, oh, how about if we based a character on whatever, Godzilla minus one, a movie that it came out after this end of the
Mhm.
series, it's like, yeah, sure, let's figure out how that's going to work because that changed a bunch of stuff about, sort of the zeitgeist of,
Yeah.
of monsters or whatever. Um, but yeah, and so I mean, there was a lot of planning, and then there was also a lot of improvising all the
Yeah.
way through. I think it's important to be able to improvise because I think I would be pretty bored if I just came up with the idea and then I just executed it for 6 years. It would just
Yeah, no, you can keep yourself on your toes,
yeah, that's right.
otherwise it becomes, rote and uninteresting, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah,
But
and when something comes out, it's like well, there's a character in it named Woofy who's like he's like Manila. He's like the son of Godzilla.
yeah,
And
right.
so he was always going to have this moment where he would sort of like something would happen and he would power up and he would kind of become like, his second stage or whatever.
Yeah.
And originally I was going to do like there was an old Godzilla movie where he turned red and and glowed and he was extra radioactive or
Right.
whatever. But like right then Shin Godzilla came out and I was like, "Oh, well, that's the new power up is that he's purple and he has beams and, that stuff." And so it was nice to be able to be a little bit lighter on my feet and kind of go like, oh yeah, that's more fun, easier, more fun to draw, more, a better color scheme, etc. So
I find it interesting that sort of that you have a fully told tale to in terms of how you've told it, but yet the concept is so flexible that you feel like and I'm glad you guys are pitching it to animation. I could really see it on something like Adult Swim or
oh yeah,
one of those really more experimental really kind of
yeah.
crazy animations.
Well, and what I liked about Kaijumax is that it was very much a comic book. Like it wasn't something where it seemed like a pitch for a TV show. It
Yeah.
wasn't something that seemed like it would be better in another version. But I do think that like yeah, in translating it to TV, you'd have to sort of like strip out a couple, like a lot of little puns that are kind of visual puns or like a lot of the deep cuts. It's like might scale those back, but then you get so much more by having characters be voiced and kind of go like, oh, well, what if we have a Jersey Devil and he sounds like Tony Soprano? And like, what if we have you know, and like, so there's a whole bunch of like, you know, so much can be happening with the voices that like you wouldn't miss, some of the visual stuff maybe that would kind of get dropped out or get de-emphasized or whatever. I think that there's so much interesting stuff that can happen in a change of a change of media.
Yeah, I agree. So that brings us pretty much up to present, I'd say. What are you working on now that you can tell us about? I know a lot of times things are
Well,
a little bit close to
yeah,
the vest.
I have a creator-owned series that I'm working on the first issue now. It's going to come out from Image, and it's a horror series. It's basically the opposite of Kaijumax. Like it's instead of having 1,000 characters and being in full color, it's black and white, and it's super downbeat, and and like there's 3 characters, and it's got a gimmick to it, and like so I think it's gonna be really fun to do. It's a little bit it's I'm having to like readjust how I'm doing things, how I'm drawing things, because it's like I didn't realize how good I had it on Kaijumax, because it's like even though there were a million things going on, it's like the background was always just sort of like some hills
Right.
with with all the samey, the bushes and rocks and stuff on it. that was a cinch. Like I could do that in my sleep. But
Yeah.
now it's like, oh yeah, these are like people, and they got to live in a town where there's, and and it's got to be buildings, and those buildings have to be consistent and make sense, and like have doors and windows, and oh boy, I don't know how people do it. But it's fun, and I mean it's interesting too because because Kaijumax was very much a, in terms of lore, it was like I just kind of build on it as I went, and try not to contradict myself, but also kind of like, again, be light on my feet and be able to go like, oh yeah, like this is what the cops are like. Did I say something different? Well, it's more like this. You know, Whereas this new story is meant to be built on sort of a rock solid lore and not contradict itself. And so, for one thing, that means it has to be a lot shorter because I can only keep that stuff in mind for so long. Um, yeah, and I mean it's more of a mystery type of thing. So, yeah, it's interesting to sort of to change art styles, writing styles, lore styles,
Genre.
everything about it.
Hey, everybody, we are back. What'd you think of that interview? I really enjoyed talking to Xander. He is a down-to-earth guy. Love all the kinds of things he's into, from sci-fi, from, the kaiju stuff, and really look forward to whatever else he's working on. He's a great artist and seems to really have found his niche and what he likes to do. And we love that around here because they bring the passion. But that'll do it for this episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Xander, for being on the show. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you found this episode. We're trying to grow the program, and I know you guys are with us. So please get the word out, and we'll do the same. So until next time, peace.